Welcome. My name is Stephen. I'm the pastor at Hope City. We're delighted that you're tuning in to watch our online service. We would love for you to come and visit us in person. To do that, you need to register using the link below in the description. And if you'd like to find out more information about the church, you can sign up for our email. There's a link below for that, or you can check out our website, hopecity.co.za. Enjoy the service.
Ruth was written in the time of the Judges, and it gives us a snapshot into how women were treated in the time of the Judges. So, Judges actually is probably one of the most difficult books to read if you look at it from the point of view of how women were treated. It ends, for example, the book of Judges ends where the Benjaminites, one of the tribes of Israel, had been left womenless and had been ostracized by the rest of Israel and said, we're not going to allow any of our women to marry any of your men. You can read the story, it's fascinating. So here's Benjamin staring down the barrel of oblivion because there was no chance of them marrying within Israel, and the law of God is very clear that they were not supposed to marry outside of Israel. So because the rest of Israel had given an oath to the Lord, they weren't able then to sort of say, okay, we forgive you, we'll move on. They were stuck. So what they told the Benjaminites to do was go and kidnap the singers of Shiloh, the women singers of Shiloh, and marry them. Sounds like a quaint story, but if you happen to be one of the singers of Shiloh, it was not a nice situation. So let me bring it right down into Africa and South Africa. In Africa, we have a tremendous amount of good things going on, but we are plagued by continual gender-based violence. And in our own nation, it's reaching, if you think COVID-19 is reaching pandemic proportions, GBH across, against our women is just terrible. Gender-based violence and grievous bodily harm to our women, not to mention the psychological damage, and to our children. And we have just launched, as a nation under the president, 16 days of activism. And so I want us to read Ruth and look at Ruth in a number of levels. One, Ruth tells us a story about homecoming. Number two, it tells us a story, a very African story. It's a story of famine, despair, loss, and restoration. It's a story that, look, I'm a narrative theologian, so if I want to tell you about the narrative, it deals with all sorts of political things, but actually, it was designed to be told as a story, and it gives us a little snapshot about what was happening in the time of Ruth. One of a Nigerian theologian, Tokungu Ademeyo, says this: given the sordid story with which the book of Judges ends, the story I just told you, it is no surprise that the book ends with the condemnatory words of, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. And that's how the book of Judges ends, in this kind of despairing place. Now, Ruth is set in that kind of milieu, where it was very, very tough. And it was particularly tough on women and children. So I could go on and I could read you about 5 or 10 other things Ruth was designed to do, but I'm not going to read them. I just want to point out that a Malawian theologian, Isabel Piri, she writes, it is clear that from the way the story is narrated, that it existed in oral form before being written down. For example, and you must read it, it's really clear. The end of each chapter introduces the coming chapter, creating a sense of anticipation in the listeners. If you read Ruth like you're being told a story, it's dramatic. So what you should try and do is ignore the chapters and verses, because they weren't in the original. The one part of the Bible that you've got in your hand that's not inspired by God are the chapters and verses divisions. Just read it. And you can see people telling this story the story of Ruth and Naomi. This oral background is the one reason the story is very appealing to the oral society of Africa, where storytelling isn't a familiar form of communication. I happen to be a very good storyteller, and some of them are even true. All right. The background to chapter 1 of Ruth, we're going to get to our text in a minute, but I want you to notice the background of chapter 1, and this will help you in your reading of Ruth, is you're introduced to 3 male characters. The 3 male characters are Elimelech, that is Naomi's husband, Machlon, that's her first son, and Chilion, her second son. Elimelech is her husband. Her first son, Machlon, his name literally means sickness or illness. Chilion means failing. And names are very important in this book. And then these 3 guys, after a few verses, disappear from the story. And what comes out is the story of women in the economy of God. And I'm going to try and do a number of things. First of all, I want to just try and help you to grasp what it is that people go through. And as a man, it's really difficult. So ladies, please forgive me. I'm going to do my level best to try and express some of the things that I have personally seen and had to help people walk through and work through. I'll try to keep it as least traumatic as possible. But we need in our nation to deal with this stuff. And men, can I just say this? It's time we stood up and said, we're not having this anymore. We're not going to treat our women or allow our women to be treated in this way anymore. I, for one, I've been doing it for some time now. If I see something, I'm going to say, stop that. Can I give you an example? When we get married, we make our covenant promises in marriage to each other in the presence of God and our family and friends, the community. What is the reason? So that we can be held accountable by our family and friends under God for the promises we make. We're not supposed to be saying to our mates who are married and we know they've got a girlfriend, it's okay. We're supposed to say, no, it's not okay. Sorry, I'm very blunt. Is that straight enough? Is that direct enough? We're supposed to be holding each other to account for the promises people make before God and before the community. And we don't shout at each other. We must talk to each other, build a relationship so people can hear each other. So now let me take you through an overview of Ruth very quickly before we come to chapter 1. So you've got 3 main characters. If the 3 men we just mentioned disappeared and become just a vague backdrop to the story, the 3 women in our story, 2 of them become the main characters, and the third one disappears at the end of chapter 1. We learn about gleaning, and can I just say, gleaning sounds like a lovely thing. They leave the harvest around the edges, and the poor who have got nothing and destitute pick it up. But it put people, because they were mainly women that did this, at risk of being assaulted and worse. And if you read the book of Ruth, it's incredibly clear in the book of Ruth. It sounds, we hear these stories in Sunday school and we have these nice pictures, but the reality is not a nice picture. It's necessary, but it's not nice. And vultures, human vultures, took advantage of other people's poverty. And today we have a similar account. We as humans have not changed a great degree. Those who have not are often picked on by those who have, so they can have more. All right? And men still pick on the weak. And it's time we, as men, stood up and said, we're not doing that anymore. I won't do it anymore. Nobody else must. Secondly, you see a wonderful story, and this is another story you all know about, Ruth connecting with Boaz. You're introduced to the concept of the kinsman redeemer. You're introduced into a marriage covenant and community covenant, a Gentile entering into the community covenant of Israel and actually entering into the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Interestingly, in the genealogy, can I just suggest you check them out? Some women are mentioned. Majority were Gentiles before they became part of the covenant community. The Lord is very clever. When our communities have an area which is blind to how he wants to view people, he often subtly puts in genealogy. So, for example, Bathsheba in the genealogy of Jesus isn't referred to as the wife of David. She's referred to as the wife of Uriah. I'll leave those who know the Bible a bit more to ponder that one. All right, let's read our text. This is out of the frying pan. Think Africa, think refugee, asylum seekers, think famine, think what's real in Africa that you see on the news that inoculates us to the reality. One of the things that happens in the story of Ruth is it takes the inoculating effect of the deluge of trauma that the TVs give us and helps us to make it real because we see it in a person. And may I just suggest to you, it's one of the ways that will really help you to be able to feel the impact of what happens in society is when you connect. We can't solve them all, but when you get involved with one thing, like the SA Children's Home, you can say you can make an impact there. We can't make an impact everywhere. So when you're buying things in the shop, and if you want to know what to buy, sorry, little advert, you can pick this up, and then you can buy them, all right? And you can bring them here, and we will transfer them up there. Here's the story. Think Africa. Think God giving us a snapshot of the situation of women. Think how relevant this is to us today. And then ask, how would we respond? In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Simple story. A family displaced from the land of promise because of famine, and they flee to a neighboring country for refuge. So, you know, in those days, they didn't have the same border guards we have, and there wasn't the same tightness about things. But you just got to look across the world now. All over the world, displaced people. Here's a story in the Bible that gives us a little snapshot of one family's circumstances that drove them to, what happened to them, and how God led them afterwards. So here we go. Out of the frying pan, Elimelech leads his family from a state of famine into Moab where they can feed themselves. Unfortunately, they go out of the frying pan into the fire. Verse 3. Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Sometimes, and I dealt with asylum seekers for numbers of years, and sometimes you cannot believe how trauma upon trauma upon trauma seems to deluge in upon one small group or even one person. So I thought what I'll do is I'll tell you a story. As this is a story, let me tell you a story. At one stage in the church in which I was pastoring, we had about 120 displaced people desperately seeking for accommodation. And I formed relationships with most of those guys, and I used to get their stories. And one day I thought I would ask one of the guys, because he's such a lovely guy, to tell his story. And he told his story about how he left his country of origin, escaped the war, come down through neighboring countries, and arrived in Cape Town. He and his brother and his friend had left. And so the next week, in another context, I brought him with me, and he told his story. And so it went on. About the 3rd week, I realized there was a bit of his story I didn't get. So I invited him to come to my office, and we sat down, and over a cup of coffee, we had a discussion. I said, "Where did you live?" And he told me his village, and we looked it up on a map, and I said, "Now I understand." And, you know, were you the older brother? Was your brother the older brother? And was your friend? Is it your brother's friend or your friend? We got the whole story. So he came down, and then all of a sudden, when they got to the border of South Africa, his brother disappeared from the story. And I said to him, I've noticed every time you tell the story, right between there and there, your brother stops being part of the story. And he started crying. And he said to me, we were crossing a river and the crocodiles took him. And I watched on the bank where my brother was taken 10 foot in front of me. And there was nothing I could do. He said, it's the first time I've ever been able to speak about it. The trauma that gets laid upon people because of personal circumstances is extremely deep. And one of the reasons why God has included Ruth in the canon is to help us understand the depth of the trauma of a sinful world when sin is perpetrated, and the general principle of sin seems to funnel down at times onto one small group or even one individual. So David in Psalm 37 and Psalm 73, he writes, why have I kept myself from sin when, Lord, I observe all these ungodly people? And he, as one stage, their eyes grow fat. They're so well fed. They seem to have no problems. And then he says, but if I'd said that, I would have been a brute beast before you, because I went into the temple of God, the house of the Lord, and I perceived the end of their ways. You see, we have to live in the light of eternity with our feet rooted on the ground, but we still got to live in the light of eternity. There will be in heaven no more sickness, no more sorrow, no more sighing, no more tears, but down here there will be all the above. And life is not fair. And when we take those massive pictures of people flooding across borders and we think, how do we deal with that deluge? How do we deal with it? Remember, Ruth is a story that could be an African story or an Ethiopian story, or you name it. You name it. It could be a Mexican story. So here we are. She's got out of the frying pan. Now they're in Moab, but now she's lost her husband and her 2 sons. Then she arose, verse 6, with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she hears, while she's working in the fields, that the Lord has blessed Israel, and Israel now has crops, and now she can go back. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me, talking about her sons. When we meet people who've gone through trauma, and I don't know your personal circumstances, decision-making has some dire consequences. The more that you've had stripped away from you, the more the impact of decisions impact upon your ability to sustain life and to be a blessing and to feel safe. And I'm sorry if I'm stripping off a little bit of bandages here today, but we really need to realize that with an onset now of a new variant of COVID, the likelihood is that we're going to have more poverty-stricken people in our nation. And because of that, we need somehow not to be inoculated against the struggles of the man and woman who are battling. We can't take responsibility for everything, but we can know how to call on God and say, Lord, where do we assist? How do we assist? Sorry, my personal passion's coming out here. So here's Naomi. She's going home, but this is not her daughters-in-law home, because they're Moabites. They're going home with her, but this is not their home. This is her home. I've heard this story often, how people get caught up and then they don't come from the same place, but they end up in the same place. So let's have a look at how complicated some of these relational things can be. The Lord grant you, this is Naomi speaking still to her daughters-in-law, the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. In other words, find new husbands. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it is extremely bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. We're going to deal with that sense of what it feels like when you, like David felt in Psalm 73 and Psalm 37, I commend those Psalms to you. Where he's saying, I'm just trying to do what you tell me to do, Lord. But it seems like every time I do these, worse things happen to me, and people just ignore you. They seem to be okay. Be honest. How many of you have wondered that in times of trouble? Okay, it's only me. All right? All right? I'm telling you guys, it's one of the ways where the battle for faith, to deepen it or to shallow it, is fought, is in real life. Not just in the understanding of the deepest bits of theology, but in where that theology is rooted in lived experience. Then they lifted up their voices and wept. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I die, and where I will also be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. I don't think we, in our comfortable westernized society, realize what a massive statement that was. Naomi was saying, and by the way, that's why those verses are taken up into the traditional wedding ceremony. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you go, I will go. Why? Because there's an agreement together. We're going to serve God together. We're going to be in this thing together. We're going to do life together. So let me just introduce you again to our three female characters in chapter 1. Firstly, we have Naomi, whose name literally means my delight, and in common parlance, sweetness. She's sweet, she's a delight. And then you get Ruth, whose name literally means female companionship, friendship. And then you get Orpah, and her name literally means she who turns back. So what you have here is a storytelling narrative. The names, Naomi, sweetness. Hold that thought, sweetness. Ruth, female companionship / friendship. If ever we need that in the world today, that's what we need. And Orpah, she who turns back. Orpah fades off the scene at this stage. Ruth and Naomi become the name and the focus of the text. So what's in a name? So the two of them, this is Naomi and Ruth now, Orpah's gone back. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? She's gone home. Obviously some years have transpired. And they're saying, Naomi, is this you? So she said to them, do not call me Naomi, sweetness. Call me Mara, bitterness. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity on me? Difficulty or calamity and the battle for identity is absolutely important in the Christian life. Can I just say this? One of the things that you will find attacked in life for your faith is who you are in Christ. Are you really a Christian? When life begins to throw things at you and you find things stirring up in you and you ask questions, God, why do I feel like life's being unjust? I'm trying so hard. And things just keep happening to me. Hello? Listen, we live in a fallen world. It doesn't work the way God intended it to work. Right? After Adam and Eve, the very next story we're told is a story of how brother kills brother. Cain kills Abel. Right? Wasn't just on Abel. It's been sown into the world through sin. This unjust, broken, twisted, and warped consequences that fall. The rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous, and so did problems fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. By the way, if we never had any problems after you became a Christian, the churches would be bursting at the seams because everybody'd want a bit of that. But we'd be totally unable to help people who were in their problems because we wouldn't be able to identify with that. Hold that thought, because that is what Jesus Christ did for us. Just be careful. How one responds to difficulty and calamity can implant a definition inside your heart that's neither helpful nor biblical. And right now, this may sound like theory to some of you, but this is going to be the reality of experience at some stage in most people's lives. When you're facing difficulty, asking yourself, how do I respond at this stage? How do I know this? You can read my life. I've written a book last year. You can ask me about it. But let me just tell you, story of my life, right? The story sets up the next phase. Right at the end, this is the end of chapter 1. Now this is what happens. Naomi returns, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So you can imagine somebody telling the story. Remember, books weren't around. They would tell the story with great passion, and people would begin to dig into the story. And now they've moved from the whole wider situation right down to the story of Ruth and Naomi. And it's the beginning of barley season. The harvest is there. And then the story continues. But I've only got chapter 1, so I want to bring you some challenges in the midst of crisis and in the midst of life. Here's the first challenge: feeling unworthy. How many of you have felt unworthy in the sight of God? Okay, you have to get used to me. I can identify with that very easily. And you know why that is? Because we are. Can I repeat that? Sometimes the reason we feel unworthy is because we are unworthy. That's why we need grace. The whole point of grace is you don't earn it because you didn't deserve it. You get it as a gift because Christ earned it. How exciting is that? I've become a bit underwhelmed by the response, but okay. Let's just read. It was read earlier on today. Graham read this text. Since we have such a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. Right, I'm going to go fast. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. I'm a charismatic. I just leave my notes, right? I just feel to say to you today, if you think God doesn't understand how you feel, He stepped out of heaven so we will know that He understands how we feel. He suffered the temptations we suffer, but without falling for them, so He knows how we feel. In fact, only the one who has been tempted and without sin will know the full extent of temptation, because when we get to A or B devil temptations, we normally fall. He got the whole gamut and He never fell. So He understands what it feels like to be tempted. Just think of the Garden of Gethsemane. Father, if it be Thy will, let this cup pass from me. Speaking about the wrath and judgment of God upon the sins of the world. And He's taking that, and His humanity is rebelling. And He's so emotional and it's so traumatic for Him that the blood vessels in His skin break. And He begins to sweat drops of blood. And He says, Lord, but not my will, yours. It's a deeper temptation than in the wilderness. When the devil said to Him, do this or do that. Well, Do this and I'll give you all the nations they can worship you at no cost. Jesus chose the way of the cross to reconcile us with the Father. But he did it by entering into this world's problems so that he can lead us through them, not so that we can avoid them. There's a great temptation now in the church, and you can see it on TV every day, trying to proclaim how God will take all your problems away and make you wealthy and healthy and handsome. Well, wealthy hasn't worked for me yet. Healthy, so far, so good-ish. Handsome, sorry, no prizes there. All right? If every Christian was healthy, wealthy, and handsome again, the church would be filled with people. And you could just go down the street and say, handsome, Christian. Not so handsome, not Christian. But we are what we are, and God loves us. And he entered into this world with all its problems. And let me tell you, he was a refugee. From the infanticide of Herod, that was a result of his own birth. He had to flee with his family to Egypt. He suffered very much like we're hearing about Ruth and Naomi. And he entered into life so that we would understand that he understands. This is what Advent is about, helping us to grasp the wonder. When the Israelites were looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, they were anticipating not the coming of Jesus, but the coming of heaven in a national state in which no more sickness, no more sorrow, no more sighing, no more tears would happen. But we know that's in eternity, not down here in a fallen world. At Advent time, looking up to Christmas, by the way, I have to confess, don't do Christmas shopping very well. It's just something that I don't like, the commercialization of Christmas. So I have a friend, just to lighten the moment for a bit, who some years ago, in the right near us, there's a newish Pick and Pay, and he was shopping for what are those Christmas things, man? Mince pies. And before him was a Muslim lady. And they'd bumped into each other in the aisle before and had a little conversation and got on very well. And she was starting to load all these things. He said, hey, leave some for me. Those are ours. But they aren't. They're ours. The Advent is that longing in the heart that Ruth was feeling to come home. There was something, though, if I was going to get wax lyrical today, I'll talk about how the Lord sent the Holy Spirit. He came to convict this world of sin and righteousness and judgment, to lead us into the place where that longing in the heart of men and women is satisfied only in the person and work of Christ. When we bow the knee to Christ, we gain the dignity of being restored to God, reconciled, adopted, forgiven, and start a life. We become translated from one degree of glory to another. And you know how that happens? By learning to walk through real life with him, for him, acknowledging our failures. How many of you have known you failed at times as a Christian? I have. How many of you got the perfect prayer life? I don't. How many of you have read the book of Leviticus and thought, wow, that's just amazing? How many of you got the book of Revelation and thought, now I understand? How many of you know exactly what I'm talking about? All right? So what I want to say to you guys today is this. Advent is the time when that longing inside, put there by God, that a fallen creation made in his image, men and women, would become aware of our need and be drawn to him. The world is actually an Advent world without knowing it. With the longing to be reconciled to a God they don't know upon them. And the time of the birth of Christ, when we celebrate the incarnation at Christmas, it's a time when we have a message that rings out and draws people and say, that's the answer to this longing. I had no way of describing it, but I know it's there. And I've tried to fill it with everything else, but the answer is in Christ. So, If I could just move on, I'm not going to do all these. Right, the call home. Right, let's go to the, yes, let's do this one, the call home. The call home to the Lord is echoed through the covenant meal, communion. You see, in the communion, we are confronted with the reason we need to be reconciled. We're confronted with our sins. We're confronted with the reality that none of us deserve to go to heaven because we're good, or because we're educated, or because we're handsome. Certainly not me. We are comforted by the fact that the penalty we deserve has been paid. And we remember its price. Grace is free to us, but it costs God everything in heaven's treasury. Grace is incredibly expensive. It costs the life of God the Son. And we get it for nothing as we bow the knee. We celebrate this reconciliation through Christ. Come home to Him today. If you're somebody here and you've come to church, I don't know, you may have been coming to Union for 40 years and you may not be a Christian. Just coming to Union, being a Congregationalist, is not going to make you acceptable for heaven. Christ does. You can stand in the pulpit and preach every Sunday. It doesn't make you a Christian. Bowing the knee to Jesus Christ, acknowledging your sinfulness, and falling into the grip of grace is what makes one a Christian. So be encouraged. Be encouraged. The price is paid.